Welcome. We are gathered here today, in this digital scriptorium, to contemplate an object of such profound ubiquity that it has become effectively invisible, an artifact so fundamental to the material construction of our modern world that its absence would precipitate a collapse of quite literally everything we have built. I speak, of course, of the humble screw. More specifically, we are here to embark on a rather lengthy and, some might say, needlessly thorough examination of its thread. For in the intricate, spiraling helix of the screw thread lies a story of order wrested from chaos, of consensus forged in the crucible of industrial necessity, and of a quiet revolution that was fought not on battlefields, but in the meeting rooms of technical committees and on the drafting tables of meticulous engineers. Before the latter half of the 19th century, the world of mechanical fasteners was a veritable Babel, a pandemonium of incompatibility. A bolt forged in a Philadelphia workshop would find no home in a nut tapped in a Boston factory. The repair of a steam engine, a cotton gin, or a locomotive was not a matter of procuring a replacement part, but of commissioning a new, bespoke component, handcrafted to fit its unique and idiosyncratic mate. This was a world of profound inefficiency, a silent brake on the engine of progress. Over the next 3 hours, we will trace the slow, deliberate, and painstakingly technical journey toward the standardization of the screw thread in the United States. We will meet the key figures, dissect their arguments, and examine the very geometry of their proposals. We will explore the resistance to change and celebrate the eventual, quiet triumph of uniformity. This is not a story of daring escapades or dramatic confrontations. It is a story of measurement, of angles, of pitch, and of the profound beauty to be found in rational, systematic agreement. It is, in its own way, one of the great unsung epics of the Industrial Revolution. If you are an individual who finds a deep and abiding satisfaction in the meticulous ordering of the world, if the establishment of a common standard from a state of anarchic diversity resonates with your soul, then you have found a suitable place to rest for a while. I encourage you to subscribe to this channel and to enable notifications, so as not to miss future explorations into the foundational bedrock of our structured reality. Furthermore, I invite you to contribute to our collective understanding. Please leave a comment below detailing your own personal experiences with the frustrations of incompatible threads, be it in assembling furniture, repairing an appliance, or any other mundane encounter with this lingering ghost of a pre-standardized age. We will read your accounts with the focused interest they so richly deserve. Now let us begin. To truly appreciate the monumental achievement of a standardized screw thread, one must first immerse oneself in the world that existed before it, a world that, from our modern perspective of interchangeable parts, seems almost impossibly inefficient and chaotic. Let us venture into the heart of a mid-19th century American workshop. The air is thick with the scent of hot metal, coal smoke, and machine oil. The cacophony is overwhelming. The rhythmic clang of hammers on anvils, the hiss of the steam engine powering the line shaft, the groan of lathes turning iron. Here a master machinist, a man of immense skill and practical knowledge, is attempting to repair a critical piece of machinery, perhaps a power loom or a steam-powered pump. A single, crucial bolt has sheared. The fate of the factory's production schedule rests on its replacement. Today, this would be a trivial task. One would measure the bolt's diameter and thread pitch, consult a chart, and retrieve an identical replacement from a bin containing hundreds, if not thousands, of perfect copies. The entire operation might take less than 5 minutes. But for our 19th century machinist, the ordeal is just beginning. The sheared bolt is not a standard. It is a unique artifact, born of this specific workshop, or perhaps another one 100 miles away. Its diameter is not a neat fraction of an inch, but some arbitrary dimension dictated by the available bar stock on the day it was made. Its threads were cut on a lathe by a craftsman who used hand-ground tools and his own personal sense of what constituted a good thread. The angle of the thread walls, the pitch, the depth, all of it is idiosyncratic. The nut it once mated with is equally unique, a perfect, hand-fitted partner to this one bolt and no other. Our machinist cannot simply go to a hardware supplier. Such a supplier, selling fasteners for general use, would stock a bewildering and unsystematic array of items from countless small manufacturers, each with their own house style of thread. The chances of finding a match would be infinitesimally small. No, he must fabricate a replacement from scratch. He begins by selecting a piece of wrought iron bar stock, turning it down on his lathe to match the peculiar diameter of the original. Then comes the most difficult part, replicating the thread. He must carefully measure the number of threads per inch on the broken piece. He adjusts the gearing on his lathe to approximate this pitch. Then he must hand grind a cutting tool, attempting to match the V-shape of the original thread by eye. This process is an art form. A slight deviation in the angle, a slip of the hand on the grinder, and the new bolt will not fit the existing nut. After multiple passes, cautiously carving the helical groove into the iron, he will attempt to test it. If it is too tight, he must take another infinitesimal cut. If it is too loose, he must discard the piece and begin the entire, laborious process anew. Hours, or even a full day, could be consumed by the creation of this single, humble bolt. Now, multiply this scenario by every machine in every factory, every locomotive on every railroad, and every musket in every arsenal across the nation. This was the pre-standardization pandemonium. It was a world where every screw was an island, a testament to individual craftsmanship, but a formidable barrier to industrial scale, maintenance, and progress. The economic cost of this inefficiency was staggering, a constant, invisible tax on productivity, innovation, and repair. The problem of thread incompatibility was not, of course, uniquely American. It was a malady that afflicted the entire industrializing world. And as is so often the case in the history of technology, the first significant steps toward a cure were taken in Great Britain, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. To understand the American journey, we must first look across the Atlantic to the pioneering work of two British engineers, Henry Maudslay and his student, Joseph Whitworth. Henry Maudslay, born in 1771, was a genius of the machine shop. His most celebrated invention, the screw-cutting lathe, perfected around the year 1800, was the very tool that made the problem of screw proliferation possible. Before Maudslay, cutting a long, consistent screw thread was an arduous and imprecise task. His lathe, with its slide rest and lead screw linked by changed gears, transformed the process. For the first time, a machinist could mechanically produce screws with a specified and repeatable number of threads per inch. Maudslay had, in effect, created a machine for making machines. However, in doing so, he also gave every workshop the power to create its own unique and non-interchangeable threads. Maudslay himself recognized the paradox he had created. He was a systematizer at heart. In his own workshop, he established a set of standards. He created a series of master taps and dies, ensuring that every screw and nut produced within his factory walls was perfectly interchangeable. This was a revolutionary concept in microcosm. He had created a closed system of order. His apprentices, upon leaving to start their own enterprises, would often take with them copies of the Maudslay threads. Yet, this was a system of propagation by discipleship, not a universal standard. It was a step, but a small one. The wider industrial world remained a tapestry of mismatched threads. The man who would take Maudslay's localized concept and attempt to apply it to an entire nation was Joseph Whitworth. Born in 1803, Whitworth was a brilliant toolmaker who had spent time in Maudslay's London workshop. He was possessed of an almost obsessive passion for precision and measurement. He famously created a set of master plane surfaces so perfectly flat that when one was slid upon another, the air between them was expelled, and the molecular attraction, or ringing, held them fast. This was a man who understood the power of precision. In the late 1830s, Whitworth turned his formidable intellect to the problem of screw threads. He undertook a truly Herculean task. He collected a vast sample of screws from workshops all over Britain. He meticulously measured and analyzed them, documenting the wild variations in diameter, pitch, and thread form. From this sea of chaotic data, he sought to derive an optimal, rational average. In 1841, he presented his findings in a paper to the Institution of Civil Engineers titled On a Uniform System of Screw Threads. Whitworth's proposal was elegant in its practicality. He proposed a standard thread angle of 55 degrees. This was, he argued, a sound compromise found in many of the samples he collected. Critically, he also proposed that the crest and root of the thread should be rounded. This was a key innovation. Sharp, V-shaped threads were prone to stripping and creating stress concentrations at the root, making the bolt weaker. The rounded form made for a stronger, more durable fastener. He then laid out a table specifying the exact number of threads per inch for a range of common diameters. For a half-inch bolt, for instance, there would be 12 threads per inch. This was the Whitworth standard. It was logical, mechanically sound, and comprehensive. Its adoption was not mandated by law, but driven by its sheer utility. Railway companies, shipbuilders, and major manufacturers saw the immense benefits, and by the 1860s, the British Standard Whitworth, or BSW, had become the de facto standard across Great Britain and its empire. It was the first national screw thread standard in the world, a monumental achievement that provided a powerful precedent and a clear lesson for the burgeoning industrial power across the ocean, the United States of America. While Great Britain was consolidating around the Whitworth standard, the United States was in the throes of its own explosive industrial and territorial expansion. This period, from the 1830s to the Civil War, was the crucible in which the absolute necessity of standardization was forged. The American context presented unique challenges and pressures that made the lack of a screw thread standard not just an inefficiency, but a critical vulnerability. Consider the geography of the nation. Unlike compact Great Britain, the United States was a vast, sprawling continent. Its industries were not clustered in a few regions, but were spreading westward. The railroad was the artery of this expansion, a network of iron stretching over thousands of miles, pushing into territories far from the established manufacturing centers of the Northeast. A locomotive, complex machine with thousands of threaded fasteners, was a microcosm of the problem. A bolt that failed on a locomotive in rural Pennsylvania could be replaced with relative ease, as the workshop of the Pennsylvania Railroad was nearby. But what if that same bolt failed in the middle of the Illinois prairie, or crossing the Sierra Nevada? The machine was stranded. The line was blocked. A replacement would have to be forged by a local blacksmith with no knowledge of the original thread, or the entire component would have to be shipped hundreds of miles back east for repair. The logistical and economic consequences were immense. The railroads, more than any other industry, felt the acute pain of incompatibility. The same story played out in agriculture. The mid-19th century saw the mechanization of the American farm, with the proliferation of inventions like Cyrus McCormick's reaper and John Deere's steel plow. These machines allowed a single farmer to cultivate vast tracts of land, turning the Midwest into the nation's breadbasket. But these machines were also subject to immense stress and frequent breakdowns. A farmer in Kansas whose reaper broke down during the critical harvest window could not afford to wait weeks for a bespoke part to be shipped from a factory in Chicago. The lack of interchangeable parts meant that a simple mechanical failure could lead to financial ruin. The dream of mechanized agriculture was constantly haunted by the nightmare of the non-standard repair. Perhaps the most compelling argument for standardization came from the realm of national defense. The U.S. government, through its armories at Springfield and Harper's Ferry, had become a world leader in the concept of manufacturing with interchangeable parts, a system often dubbed the American system. Beginning with Eli Whitney and John H. Hull, the goal was to produce muskets with such precision that a lock from one could fit perfectly into the stock of another. This was a revolutionary military and manufacturing doctrine. It meant that damaged rifles could be quickly repaired on the battlefield by cannibalizing parts from other weapons. It streamlined production and logistics. However, this interchangeability often broke down at the smallest and most numerous component, the screw. While major components might be standardized within a single armory, the screws used to hold them together often were not. Different contractors supplying the government used their own thread patterns. Even within a single model of rifle, screws made in different years might not interchange. The dream of perfect interchangeability was being thwarted by the tyranny of the bespoke screw. The military, with its existential need for reliable and reparable equipment, became a powerful, if initially quiet, proponent of a national standard. Thus, the very forces that defined 19th century America, expansion, mechanization, and the pursuit of industrial efficiency, all converged on this single technical problem. The nation was building a complex, interconnected machine, but it had forgotten to agree on the specifications for the nuts and bolts that held it all together. The pressure was building, and the search for a solution was becoming a matter of national industrial urgency. In the search for a solution to the chaos of screw threads, a central stage was required, a place where engineers, manufacturers, and academics could gather, debate, and forge a consensus. In the United States, that role was filled by the Franklin Institute of the state of Pennsylvania for the promotion of the mechanic arts, located in Philadelphia. Founded in 1824, the Institute was one of the oldest and most respected scientific and technical organizations in the country. It was a nexus of American innovation. The Franklin Institute was not a remote academic body. It was deeply enmeshed in the industrial world. Its members were the very men who were building the new America: railroad tycoons, factory owners, master machinists, and pioneering engineers. They published a prestigious journal, the Journal of the Franklin Institute, which disseminated technical knowledge across the nation. They held exhibitions showcasing the latest inventions and awarded medals for excellence in the mechanic arts. Crucially, the Institute had a long history of investigating practical problems and recommending solutions. They had conducted landmark investigations into the causes of steam boiler explosions, a terrifyingly common industrial disaster of the era. They were, in essence, a private body that functioned as a National Bureau of Standards long before the official National Bureau of Standards was established in 1901. It was therefore natural that the Franklin Institute would turn its attention to the screw thread problem. The issue would have been a constant topic of informal conversation among its members. A machine tool builder would lament his inability to source consistent bolts for his lathes. A textile mill owner would complain about the downtime caused by a non-standard fastener on a spinning mule. These individual frustrations, when shared within the collegial and problem-solving environment of the Institute, began to coalesce into a collective demand for action. In the early 1860s, the Institute decided to formalize this demand. It resolved to form a special committee to study the problem of screw-thread incompatibility and to propose a national standard. This was a momentous decision. It elevated the issue from a shop floor grievance to a subject of serious, high-level scientific and engineering inquiry. The formation of the committee was a declaration that the era of thread anarchy must end. The committee's mandate was clear: to investigate the existing practices, to evaluate the merits of different thread forms, and to recommend a single, unified system that could be adopted by all American manufacturers. This was an audacious goal. It would require navigating the competing interests of powerful industries, challenging decades of workshop tradition, and making a technical judgment that would have consequences for a century to come. The men appointed to this committee were not chosen lightly. They were among the most respected mechanical minds of their time. They understood the stakes. The Franklin Institute was lending its immense prestige to this endeavor. Their recommendation, if sound and well argued, would carry enormous weight. The stage was set in Philadelphia. The forum for order had been established. All that was needed was a champion to lead the charge. Into the well-ordered halls of the Franklin Institute and onto the stage of the screw-thread debate stepped the pivotal figure in our story, William Sellers. To understand the standard that would eventually bear his name, one must first understand the man. Sellers was not merely an advocate for standardization. He was the living embodiment of the principles he preached. His mind was a place of geometric precision, and his company, William Sellers and Company of Philadelphia, was a testament to the power of rational, systematic design. Born in 1824 to a prominent family of Quaker engineers, Sellers was steeped in the world of machinery from his youth. He apprenticed as a machinist and, by the age of 21, was already managing a large machine shop. In 1848, he founded his own company, which would quickly become one of the most advanced and respected machine tool manufacturers in the world. William Sellers and Company did not just build machines. It built machines with a distinct and revolutionary philosophy. Sellers' design aesthetic was one of severe functional elegance. He stripped away the ornate, classical embellishments that were common on machinery of the time. He believed that a machine's form should be dictated entirely by its function and the scientific principles of mechanics. His lathes, planers, and steam hammers were characterized by their clean lines, their rational distribution of metal for strength, and their almost brutalist simplicity. This was a stark contrast to the often clumsy and aesthetically overwrought designs of his competitors. He championed a machine gray paint color, which not only protected the metal but also made it easier to spot cracks or flaws, a purely functional choice that became an industry standard. This philosophy of rational design extended to every aspect of his business. He was a relentless systematizer. He introduced the use of decimal measurements in his workshops, a departure from the complex system of binary fractions of an inch, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, etc. that was then common. He understood that a decimal system was far more logical for calculation and precision machining. Within his own factory, he, like Maudslay before him, had established a rigid system of screw threads. Every fastener used in a Sellers machine was part of a coherent, interchangeable system. This was not just for his own convenience. It was a core part of his product's value. A customer who bought a Sellers machine knew that they were buying a piece of equipment that was rationally designed and easily maintainable. When the Franklin Institute formed its committee on screw threads, William Sellers was the obvious choice to lead it. He was not only a prominent member and a past president of the Institute, but his entire career was a prelude to this very task. He possessed the technical expertise to analyze the engineering merits of different thread forms. He had the practical experience as a major manufacturer to understand the needs of industry, and he had the immense personal and professional credibility to persuade others to follow his lead. He was not an abstract theoretician. He was a man who had already proven, on his own shop floor, that standardization worked. He approached the problem not with the zeal of a revolutionary, but with the cool, analytical precision of the master machinist that he was. He saw the chaotic landscape of American screw threads not as a personal affront, but as an irrational and inefficient system that was simply waiting to be replaced by a better one. The problem had found its man. The first meeting of the Franklin Institute's Committee on Screw Threads and Nuts, chaired by William Sellers, was not a scene of high drama. There were no rousing speeches or thunderous declarations. Instead, it was an exercise in measured, almost sober deliberation, befitting the technical nature of their task. The men gathered around a large table in a quiet room at the Institute's Philadelphia headquarters. They were engineers, inventors, and industrialists, men accustomed to dealing with the hard realities of iron and steam, of tolerances and measurements. Their first order of business was to survey the existing landscape, much as Whitworth had done in Britain 2 decades prior. But their approach was perhaps more systematic, reflecting Sellers' own methodical nature. They did not simply collect random bolts. They sent out formal requests to the leading industrial concerns of the day, The great railroad lines like the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Baltimore and Ohio, the major machine tool builders, including their own companies, and crucially, the United States Navy, which operated its own extensive shipyards and workshops. The responses they received confirmed what they already knew anecdotally. It was a picture of near-total anarchy. While many manufacturers used a V-shaped thread, the angle of that V varied wildly. Some used 60 degrees, some 55, some 50, and many used angles that were not a whole number at all, but simply the result of a hand-ground cutting tool. The pitches, or number of threads per inch for a given diameter, were equally varied. A half-inch bolt from one maker might have 12 threads per inch, another 13, and a third some fractional number that defied easy categorization. The only semblance of order was that individual workshops, like Sellers' own, had their own internal standards. The Pennsylvania Railroad, for example, had its own system, but it was incompatible with the Baltimore and Ohio system, a fact that created endless headaches when rolling stock from one line had to be repaired on the tracks of another. The committee's discussions would have been intensely technical. They would have spread out drawings and sample bolts on the table, examining them under magnifying glasses. They would have debated the merits of different thread profiles. A key point of discussion was the British Whitworth Standard. It was the only existing national standard in the world, and it had a proven track record. The idea of simply adopting it for the United States must have been tempting. It would have offered the tantalizing prospect of an international standard, at least within the English-speaking world. However, the committee, and Sellers in particular, had reservations. The 55-degree thread angle of the Whitworth system was one issue. It was a difficult angle to measure and replicate accurately in the workshop without specialized gauges. A 60-degree angle, by contrast, could be easily laid out using basic geometric principles. Furthermore, the rounded crests and roots of the Whitworth thread, while strong, were also more complex to machine. They required special tooling to create the precise radius. This was the core of the committee's challenge. They were not just searching for a theoretically perfect thread, but a practically manufacturable one. The standard had to be easy to adopt for the thousands of small and medium-sized workshops across America, not just for a few highly advanced firms like Sellers' own. It needed to be democratic in its accessibility. The deliberation was slow and painstaking. They were not rushing to a conclusion. They were laying the intellectual groundwork for a decision that would shape American industry for the next century. This was not a process of invention, but of careful, rational selection and refinement. They were architects of a new industrial order, and they were meticulously drawing up the blueprints. At the heart of the technical debate within the Franklin Institute's committee lay a seemingly minuscule detail that carried immense practical consequences: the angle of the screw thread's V-shaped walls. The entire discussion can be distilled into a contest between two numbers: 55 degrees, the angle of the established British Whitworth standard, and 60 degrees, the angle that would ultimately be championed by William Sellers. This was not a debate born of arbitrary preference. It was a deep and consequential argument about manufacturability, ease of verification, and the very philosophy of a good standard. Let us first reconsider the Whitworth standard. Joseph Whitworth had chosen 55 degrees after his extensive survey of existing British screws, finding it to be a common and effective compromise. from a purely mechanical standpoint, it was an excellent choice. The angle was robust and provided good flank engagement. However, its primary drawback lay in its geometry. A 55-degree angle is not easily derived from simpler shapes. For a machinist on the shop floor to create or verify a cutting tool with a 55-degree point, they would require a specialized protractor or a pre-made reference gauge. In an era before the widespread availability of cheap and precise measuring tools, this was a significant barrier. It introduced a dependency on specialized equipment, which went against the American ideal of self-sufficiency in the workshop. William Sellers, a man obsessed with rational systems, saw this as a fundamental flaw. He proposed instead a thread angle of 60 degrees. His reasoning was one of geometric purity and practical simplicity. A 60-degree angle is the angle of an equilateral triangle. This was a shape every apprentice machinist learned to construct with a simple compass and straight edge. It was elemental. A machinist could easily create a reference for a 60-degree angle by simply bisecting the 120-degree angle of a hexagon, a shape easily formed by stepping a compass around a circle. Or they could construct an equilateral triangle from first principles. This meant that the accuracy of the thread was no longer dependent on a master gauge sent from a central authority. The standard was embedded in the fundamental laws of geometry, accessible to anyone with basic drafting tools. A mechanic in a remote railroad repair shop in the middle of Nebraska could, in theory, create a perfectly accurate 60-degree cutting tool with the same confidence as a master machinist in Sellers's own Philadelphia factory. This was a profoundly democratic and decentralizing concept. It put the means of production and verification of the standard directly into the hands of the user. This ease of replication was, for Sellers, paramount virtue. A standard that is difficult to check is a standard that will be poorly followed. The debate in the committee room would have been intense. Proponents of the Whitworth system would have argued for the benefits of international compatibility with the world's leading industrial power. They would have pointed to its proven strength and success. Sellers and his allies would have countered with the argument of manufacturability. They would have stressed that a standard for America must be suited to American conditions, with its vast distances and its culture of practical, get-it-done engineering. For them, the theoretical benefit of compatibility with Britain was outweighed by the concrete, everyday advantage of a thread that any competent mechanic could create and verify with ease. The 60-degree angle was simpler to machine, simpler to measure, and ultimately, simpler to adopt on a massive scale. It was a choice that prioritized domestic utility over international uniformity. In this apex of the argument, the committee was choosing a path for American industry, one based on geometric simplicity and pragmatic self-reliance. The 60-degree angle was not just a number. It was a statement of principle. Having settled on the fundamental angle of 60 degrees, the Franklin Institute Committee faced the next critical decision: the exact form of the thread's profile. A simple V-shape, terminating in a sharp point at its crest, the top of the thread, and its root, the bottom of the groove, was the easiest to conceive of and to cut with the sharp-pointed tool. This was, in fact, the common practice in many American workshops. However, a sharp V-thread possesses significant mechanical and practical flaws, a fact that both Whitworth and Sellers understood intimately. The first problem with a sharp V-thread is its inherent weakness. The sharp corner at the root of the thread acts as a stress concentrator. When the bolt is under tension, the forces are not distributed smoothly across the material, but are focused intensely on that sharp inner corner. This is analogous to how a glass cutter uses a small, sharp score to initiate a crack. This stress concentration makes the bolt significantly more susceptible to fatigue and fracture under load, precisely at the root of the thread. For a railroad car bouncing on rough tracks, or a steam engine piston rod under constant pressure, this was a critical point of failure. The second problem is one of fragility and wear. The sharp crest of the thread is easily nicked, burred, or damaged during handling and assembly. A small burr on the crest of a bolt's thread can be enough to prevent it from entering a nut, causing galling and seizure. Furthermore, the sharp cutting tools used to produce these threads were themselves delicate and wore down quickly, leading to inconsistencies in the thread profile from the beginning to the end of a long cut. Joseph Whitworth had addressed this issue in his British Standard by rounding the crest and the root of his 55-degree thread. This was an elegant solution that eliminated stress concentrations and created a more robust fastener. However, as the committee had already noted, producing these precise, rounded profiles required specialized and accurately formed cutting tools, which could be complex to manufacture and maintain. William Sellers proposed a different and characteristically pragmatic solution. He started with the theoretical 60-degree V-shape. Then he proposed to flatten the top, the crest, and fill in the bottom, the root. Specifically, he proposed to truncate the crest by 1/8 of its height and fill the root with a flat surface of the same width. The result was a thread with a flat top and a flat bottom, connected by the straight, 60-degree angled flanks. This design was a masterstroke of practical compromise. The flat root, like Whitworth's rounded root, eliminated the dangerous stress concentration of a sharp V, making the bolt much stronger. The flat crest made the thread far more resistant to damage during handling and assembly. But the real genius lay in its manufacturability. Unlike a rounded profile, a flat profile could be easily produced and measured. A machinist could grind a cutting tool with a 60-degree angle and then simply flatten the tip to a specific, measurable width. The flat at the root of the thread in the nut would be produced automatically by a tap that had this same flattened profile. The dimensions were simple fractions, easily understood and executed. Sellers's design captured most of the mechanical benefits of the Whitworth thread, strength and durability, while being significantly easier and cheaper to produce with the tools available in a typical American workshop. It replaced the geometric complexity of a radius with the simple, verifiable geometry of a straight line. It was a perfect reflection of his philosophy, a rational, functional design that prioritized ease of manufacture and verification without sacrificing core mechanical integrity. The committee was now in possession of a complete system, a 60-degree angle with a flat top and bottom. It was strong, durable, and most importantly, profoundly practical. The culmination of the committee's exhaustive work and William Sellers's intellectual leadership was presented to the world on September 21st, 1864. On that day, Sellers stood before a meeting of the Franklin Institute and delivered a paper that would echo through the corridors of American industry for a century. The paper, titled simply and authoritatively, "A System of Screw Threads and Nuts," was not a fiery polemic, but a cool, reasoned, and meticulously detailed technical proposal. It was the public unveiling of the blueprint for a new industrial order. The paper itself is a masterpiece of technical communication, embodying the clarity and precision of its author. It began not with a demand, but with a diagnosis. Sellers methodically laid out the problem, describing the inconvenience, vexation, and expense caused by the prevailing lack of uniformity. He referenced the work of Whitworth in Great Britain, acknowledging it as a laudable first step, but subtly positioning his own proposal as an improvement tailored to the specific needs and conditions of the United States. He was not just presenting a new design. He was making a case for why a new design was necessary. The core of the paper was the detailed exposition of the thread form that the committee had settled upon. Sellers explained the choice of the 60-degree angle, emphasizing, as we have discussed, its geometric simplicity and the ease with which it could be replicated by any competent mechanic. He presented it as a self-verifying standard, liberating the machinist from a dependence on proprietary gauges. Then he detailed the innovative flat top and bottom. He provided the precise formula, a truncation of 1/8 of the height from the theoretical sharp V profile. He likely used large-scale diagrams to illustrate the concept, showing the cross-section of the thread and highlighting the flat crest and root. He explained the mechanical advantages in clear, accessible language. The elimination of the weak, sharp root to increase bolt strength, and the creation of a durable, damage-resistant crest. Crucially, the paper went beyond just the thread profile. It proposed a comprehensive system. Sellers presented a table, the heart of the standard, which specified the exact relationship between the diameter of a bolt, the number of threads per inch, the pitch, and the diameter of the tap drill needed to create the hole for the corresponding nut. This was a complete recipe book for interchangeability. For a 1/4-inch bolt, there would be 20 threads per inch. For a 1/2-inch bolt, 13 threads per inch. For a 1-inch bolt, 8 threads per inch. These were not arbitrary numbers. Sellers explained that they were derived from a careful study of common practice and an empirical formula he had developed to create a smooth, logical progression as the diameters increased. This formulaic approach was itself revolutionary, replacing the ad hoc pitch selections of the past with a predictable, mathematical relationship. The tone of the paper was one of confident persuasion. Sellers was not merely an engineer. He was an industrial statesman. He appealed to the self-interest of the manufacturers and the audience, framing the adoption of the standard not as a burden, but as a path to greater efficiency, lower costs, and improved product quality. He concluded his presentation by having the Franklin Institute formally resolve to adopt his proposed system and to recommend it for general adoption throughout the country. The paper was subsequently published in the Journal of the Franklin Institute, ensuring its dissemination to engineers, academics, and industrialists across the nation and around the world. The gauntlet had been thrown down. A clear, logical, and comprehensive system was now on the table. The question that remained was whether the sprawling, individualistic, and often cantankerous world of American industry would accept it. The 1864 paper was the starting gun for the slow race towards standardization. To fully grasp why the Seller system, later known as the United States Standard USS Thread, eventually triumphed, we must delve deeper than its mere specifications. We must appreciate the inherent logic that made it so compelling, particularly within the American manufacturing context. Its success was not accidental, nor was it solely due to the prestige of the Franklin Institute or the influence of William Sellers. The system prevailed because it was a profoundly well-thought-out solution that addressed the key practical challenges of its time. Its logic can be broken down into three pillars: simplicity of generation, ease of verification, and robustness in practice. The first pillar, simplicity of generation, was perhaps its most powerful selling point. As we have explored, the 60-degree angle was chosen for its basis in elemental geometry. This cannot be overstated. In an era where many workshops were small and capital for specialized tooling was scarce, this was a radical democratization of precision. An apprentice learning his trade could be taught to create a thread-cutting tool that was not just close enough, but dimensionally correct according to the national standard, using only the most basic of instruments. The flat crest was similarly easy to generate. Grinding a flat on the tip of a pointed tool is a far simpler and more controllable operation than grinding a precise radius, as required by the Whitworth system. This meant that any machine shop in the country, from the most sophisticated locomotive works in Philadelphia to a small repair shop on the frontier, could, in theory, produce standard threads without a significant capital investment in new gauges or forming tools. It lowered the barrier to entry for adoption, making the standard accessible to the very people who needed it most. The second pillar was the ease of verification. A standard is only as good as one's ability to confirm adherence to it. The Sellers thread was exceptionally easy to inspect. The 60-degree angle could be checked with a simple center gauge, a small, flat piece of steel with 60-degree notches cut into it, which could itself be verified against an equilateral triangle. The flat crests and roots could be measured with calipers or micrometers. This ease of inspection was crucial for quality control, both for the manufacturer of fasteners and for the consumer. A railroad, for instance, could now write a procurement contract that specified Sellers' standard threads, and then use simple, readily available tools to inspect incoming shipments of bolts and nuts to ensure they met the specification. This created a system of accountability. It transformed the fastener from a matter of fit and feel to a matter of objective, verifiable measurement. The third pillar was its robustness in practice. The design was an intelligent compromise between theoretical perfection and real-world conditions. The flat root dramatically increased the tensile strength of the bolt compared to a sharp V-thread, addressing the critical issue of fastener failure. The flat crest resisted the nicks and dings that were an unavoidable part of life in a busy workshop or a rough service environment. Furthermore, the clearance created by the flat root in the nut provided a space for small amounts of dirt, debris, or imperfect machining, making the threads less likely to bind or gall during assembly. This was a design that anticipated the imperfections of the real world. It was less prone to seizure than a perfectly interfering V-thread, and more forgiving than a thread that required pristine conditions to function correctly. This trinity of logic, easy to make, easy to check, and strong in use, formed an almost unassailable argument. The Sellers system was not just a set of dimensions. It was a complete manufacturing philosophy. It was a system designed for a sprawling, pragmatic, and rapidly growing industrial nation. It respected the skills of the individual machinist by giving him the geometric tools to create the standard himself, while simultaneously enabling the mass production and quality control necessary for a large-scale industrial economy. Its inherent logic was its most potent weapon in the long campaign for adoption. A technical standard, no matter how logical or well-designed, often requires a powerful initial push to overcome the inertia of established practice. For the seller's thread, a critical catalyst came from the United States government. The endorsement and adoption of the standard by key government bodies, particularly the U.S. Navy and the Army's Ordnance Department, provided the system with an immense boost in legitimacy and created a powerful economic incentive for private industry to follow suit. The United States Navy was one of the first major organizations to officially recognize the value of the seller's proposal. In 1868, just 4 years after Sellers's paper, a board of naval engineers was convened to establish a standard set of thread proportions for use in all naval steam machinery. The Navy operated a fleet of increasingly complex steam-powered warships, which were maintained and repaired in government-run shipyards. The same problems of thread incompatibility that plagued private industry were a constant source of frustration and delay for the Navy. A warship was a floating factory, and the ability to perform rapid, reliable repairs at sea or in a foreign port was a matter of strategic importance. This naval board conducted its own thorough investigation. They considered the established Whitworth standard and the new seller's proposal. Their conclusion, echoing the logic of the Franklin Institute Committee, was a resounding endorsement of the seller's system. They cited the 60-degree angle and the flat top and bottom as being more convenient in practice and more easily produced than the British system. The Navy's official adoption of the seller's thread as the United States standard for all its engineering work was a landmark event. It meant that any private contractor wishing to build steam engines, pumps, or any other machinery for the Navy now had to conform to the seller standard. This immediately created a large, guaranteed market for seller standard fasteners and the tooling required to produce them. It transformed the standard from an academic proposal into a hard commercial reality. The Army's Ordnance Department, responsible for the design and procurement of weapons, soon followed a similar path. The lessons of Civil War, where logistical and maintenance challenges were paramount, were still fresh. The American system of interchangeable parts for firearms, pioneered at the Springfield and Harper's Ferry armories, was a core military doctrine. The lack of a screw standard was one of the final hurdles to achieving true, large-scale interchangeability. While adoption within the Army was perhaps more gradual and piecemeal than in the Navy, the direction was clear. By specifying U.S. standard threads for new rifle designs, cannons, and other military hardware, the Army added its immense purchasing power to the growing wave of support. This government adoption had a powerful ripple effect. Companies that retooled to meet government contracts found it inefficient to maintain two separate systems of screw threads, one for government work and one for their commercial products. It was far more economical to standardize their entire production on the U.S. standard. Furthermore, the government's stamp of approval gave the standard an air of officialdom and permanence. It signaled to the wider industrial community that this was not just a Philadelphia fad, but the recognized national system. The government acted as a prime mover, creating a critical mass of adoption that made it increasingly advantageous for other industries to join in. The state, by acting as a powerful and discerning customer, became one of the most effective agents in the fight against thread chaos. While the U.S. Navy and other government bodies were early and enthusiastic adopters of the Sellers Standard, one of the largest and most powerful industries in America proved to be a significant bastion of resistance: the railroads. This was ironic, as the railroads had more to gain from standardization than perhaps any other sector. Their operations were a sprawling, interconnected network, and the incompatibility of parts between different lines was a constant and costly problem. Yet, for several decades, many of the major railroad companies clung stubbornly to their own proprietary screw-thread systems. The reasons for this resistance were complex, rooted in the history, culture, and operational realities of the railroad industry. Firstly, there was the sheer scale of their existing infrastructure. A major railroad like the Pennsylvania Railroad, PRR, or the New York Central was a massive, self-contained industrial ecosystem. They owned and operated not just thousands of miles of track and hundreds of locomotives and cars, but also vast backshops where this equipment was built and maintained. Over decades, these shops had developed their own highly specific and deeply entrenched standards for everything, including screw threads. The PRR, for example, had its own thread standard that was similar to Sellers in some respects, but differed in crucial details of pitch and form. To switch to the Sellers standard would have been a monumental undertaking. It would mean replacing or modifying thousands of taps, dies, and thread-cutting lathes. It would mean retraining an entire workforce of machinists and mechanics. Most dauntingly, it would mean managing a long and chaotic transition period where a vast inventory of both old, proprietary parts and new, standard parts would have to be stocked and carefully segregated. A mechanic repairing an older locomotive would need the old-style bolts, while a new locomotive would require the U.S. standard. The potential for confusion, error, and costly delays during this transition was immense. For the powerful master mechanics who ran these shops, men who had built their careers on the existing systems, the argument of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, was a powerful one. Their system, while incompatible with the outside world, worked perfectly well within the closed universe of their own railroad. Secondly, there was a cultural element of pride and corporate identity. The great railroads were industrial empires, and their chief engineers and master mechanics were titans of their industry. They had designed and built some of the most complex and powerful machines on Earth. There was a sense that their own, time-tested standards were superior, or at least perfectly adequate for their purposes. Adopting an external standard proposed by a committee, even one as prestigious as the Franklin Institute, could be seen as a concession, an admission that their own practices were somehow deficient. This resistance created a bizarre situation. The railroads, which connected the nation, were themselves islands of incompatibility. A bolt from a PRR locomotive would not fit a nut on a Baltimore and Ohio locomotive. This problem became particularly acute at interchange points, where freight cars from one railroad were transferred to the tracks of another. If a car from the New York Central needed a minor repair while on the tracks of the Santa Fe Railway, it could cause a major logistical bottleneck. The slow, gradual adoption of the Sellers standard by the railroads was driven less by a sudden conversion and more by the relentless pressure of economics and attrition. As new locomotives and cars were built, it became more and more sensible to build them to the emerging national standard. older equipment was eventually retired. The Master Car Builders Association, an industry group, began to push for common standards for components like brakes and couplers, and screw threads were a natural part of that conversation. The resistance of the railroads demonstrates a crucial lesson in the history of standardization. Even the most logical standard can face a long and difficult battle against the inertia of immense capital investment and deeply ingrained institutional culture. The adoption of the Sellers or United States standard screw thread was not a singular event, but a slow, creeping, and uneven process that unfolded over decades. It was a generational shift, a gradual conversion of the American industrial landscape, one workshop at a time. The formal announcements by the Franklin Institute and the U.S. Navy in the 1860s were the starting point, not the finish line. The real victory was won in the subsequent 30 to 40 years through a combination of economic pressure, education, and the sheer force of attrition. The primary vehicle for the standard spread was the machine tool industry, led by firms like William Sellers and Company itself, and others like Pratt and Whitney. When a manufacturer purchased a new, state-of-the-art lathe, planer, or milling machine from one of these leading builders, that machine was constructed using U.S. standard fasteners. More importantly, if it was a screw-cutting lathe, it came equipped with the necessary change gears, and often a set of master taps and dies to produce U.S. standard threads. As old, pre-standardization machinery wore out and was replaced, the new standard physically infiltrated the workshops of America. A factory owner who had just invested a significant sum in a new Sellers lathe would be inclined to use its capabilities. It became easier and more economical to produce standard parts than to continue creating the old, bespoke ones. The ecosystem of small tool manufacturers played an equally crucial role. Companies began to mass produce and market taps, dies, and gauges for the U.S. standard. For the first time, a small machine shop or even a dedicated hobbyist could purchase a complete set of high-quality, standardized threading tools at a reasonable cost. This was a game changer. It eliminated the need for every machinist to be an expert in grinding their own idiosyncratic cutting tools. They could now buy the standard off the shelf. The availability of these tools dramatically lowered the friction of adoption. Why go to the trouble of making a non-standard bolt when the tap and die for the standard size were hanging on a rack right next to your workbench? Education and professional societies were also powerful vectors of transmission. As the standard gained acceptance, it was incorporated into engineering textbooks and curricula. A new generation of mechanical engineers and machinists learned the U.S. standard as the default, the correct way to specify and create a screw thread. For them, the old, chaotic systems were a historical curiosity, not a living practice. Organizations like the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME, founded in 1880, became strong proponents of standardization in all its forms. They published papers, established committees, and used their collective influence to promote the U.S. standard as a best practice for the profession. Finally, there was the simple, inexorable force of attrition. As the decades passed, the men who had built their careers on the old systems, the master mechanics of the railroads, the old-school machinists who trusted their eye over any standard, began to retire. They were replaced by younger men who had been trained on and saw the clear benefits of the U.S. standard. Machinery built in the 1850s and 60s reached the end of its service life and was scrapped, taking its non-standard fasteners with it to the foundry. By the turn of the 20th century, while pockets of resistance and legacy systems certainly remained, the battle was largely won. The U.S. standard was no longer a proposal. It was the ambient, assumed reality of the American workshop. The slow march had been successful, not through a single, decisive victory, but through a persistent, multifaceted campaign that gradually and irrevocably reshaped the nuts and bolts of the nation. The triumph of the U.S. standard was not solely the work of committees and large manufacturers. It was enabled and accelerated by a burgeoning and often overlooked industry, the commercial gauge and tool makers. These companies formed an essential ecosystem that translated the abstract concept of a standard into tangible, affordable, and high-quality physical objects. They were the ones who put the tools of precision and interchangeability into the hands of the masses, commercializing the very idea of a standard. In the pre-standardization era, precision measurement was the exclusive domain of a few elite workshops and scientific instrument makers. A master machinist might have a set of calipers or a steel rule, but the concept of working to tolerances of a thousandth of an inch was foreign to most. The ability to verify something as complex as a screw thread profile was exceptionally difficult. The Seller standard, with its defined geometry, created a new market demand, a demand for reliable and affordable tools to make and check that geometry. Companies like Pratt and Whitney of Hartford, Connecticut, and later Brown and Sharp of Providence, Rhode Island, rose to meet this demand. These were not just machine tool builders. They were apostles of precision. Pratt and Whitney, for example, played a crucial role in the early days of the standard. They understood that for the U.S. standard to be truly successful, there had to be a reliable, commercially available set of master gauges that everyone could refer to. They invested heavily in creating extremely accurate master taps, dies, and plug and ring gauges for the full range of U.S. standard sizes. A plug gauge is a precisely ground cylinder with the external thread profile used to check the accuracy of a tap nut. A ring gauge is its opposite, a ring with the internal thread profile used to check the accuracy of a bolt. By manufacturing and selling these gauge sets, Pratt and Whitney and others were essentially selling truth. A machine shop in Ohio could buy a set of U.S. standard gauges and know with a high degree of confidence that their products would be compatible with those made by a shop in Massachusetts that used the same reference gauges. This created a network of trust based on a shared physical standard. It elevated the quality of work across the entire country. The availability of these commercial gauges was particularly important for quality control in mass production. A factory producing thousands of bolts a day could use ring gauges to quickly and efficiently sample their output, ensuring that their production machinery was staying within tolerance. Beyond gauges, these companies mass-produced the cutting tools themselves. They developed advanced milling and grinding techniques to produce taps and dies of a quality and consistency that was impossible for a small shop to replicate. A tap, the tool used to cut internal threads in a nut, is a complex piece of geometry, with multiple cutting edges, flutes, and a precise thread profile. Commercial manufacturers could produce these hardened steel taps by the thousand, making them an affordable commodity. This commodification of the tools of standardization was a profoundly democratizing force. It meant that adherence to the standard was no longer a function of a workshop's individual skill and toolmaking, but simply a matter of purchasing the correct, commercially available tool. This unseen ecosystem of gauge and tool makers was the critical infrastructure that allowed the U.S. standard to be implemented on a national scale, turning an engineering ideal into a shop floor reality. For several decades after its introduction in 1864, the system proposed by William Sellers was known by several names. It was often called the Sellers Standard, the Franklin Institute Standard, or simply the U.S. Standard as adopted by the Navy. This multiplicity of names reflected its status as a de facto standard, widely accepted and used in practice, but without a single, universally recognized official designation. The final step in its 19th century journey was its formalization and codification under the unambiguous title of the United States Standard, or USS thread. This process of formalization was less about changing the standard itself, and more about cementing its status and clarifying its specifications. As the standard's use became more widespread, the need for a single, authoritative reference document became increasingly apparent. While Sellers' original 1864 paper and the Navy's 1868 report were the foundational texts, small variations and interpretations could still arise. Different tool manufacturers might have slightly different ideas about the optimal tolerances for a good fit. The formalization process sought to eliminate this ambiguity. This effort was championed by the leading engineering societies of the day, particularly the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASM. These organizations saw standardization as a core part of their mission to advance the profession and promote industrial efficiency. Through their committees, they brought together the leading experts from industry, academia, and government to review and codify the existing standard. They re-examined the tables of diameters and pitches, confirming or, in some cases, slightly adjusting the original Sellers formula to better reflect the evolving needs of industry. A key aspect of this formalization was the establishment of classes of fit. The original Sellers proposal defined the basic geometry of the thread, but it did not explicitly define the amount of clearance or play between a mating bolt and nut. In practice, different applications required different fits. A simple bolt for a piece of farm equipment could be a loose, easy-to-assemble fit. A high-precision lead screw for a scientific instrument, however, would require a much tighter, more precise fit with minimal backlash. The formalization process led to the definition of different classes of fit. For example, Class 1 for a loose fit, Class 2 for a general-purpose fit, and Class 3 for a tight, precision fit. This added a new layer of sophistication to the standard, allowing engineers to specify not just the size of the thread, but the quality of its engagement. By the late 1890s, the work of these committees had resulted in the widespread adoption of the name United States Standard, USS, for the coarse-threaded series that was the direct descendant of Sellers' original proposal. Engineering drawings, textbooks, and tool catalogs now referred to. For example, a January 2nd, 13 USS bolt, clearly and unambiguously defining it as having a half-inch diameter and 13 threads per inch, made to the United States Standard Profile. This formal designation was a capstone on the work begun by Sellers more than 30 years earlier. It signaled that the standard had reached maturity. It was no longer a proposal or a recommendation, It was an established and integral part of the American engineering language. The transition from Sellers to USS marked the final victory of a standard in the industrial landscape of the 19th century. The United States Standard USS Thread, with its relatively coarse pitches, was a brilliant solution for the challenges of the 19th century. It was strong, robust, and well suited for the cast iron and wrought iron construction of steam engines, railroad equipment, and heavy machinery. However, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a new set of technological challenges emerged that revealed the limitations of a single coarse thread series. The advent of the automobile and the airplane created a demand for a new kind of fastener, and with it, a new thread standard. The early automobile was a creature of constant, high-frequency vibration. The rough roads and the shaking of the primitive internal combustion engine subjected every component of the vehicle to relentless stress. Engineers quickly discovered that the coarse USS threads had a tendency to loosen under these conditions. The steep helix angle of a coarse thread provides less frictional resistance to rotation, making it more susceptible to vibrating loose without a locking mechanism. Furthermore, in applications where precise adjustments were needed, such as in carburetors or steering linkages, the large axial movement for each turn of a coarse-threaded screw was not ideal. There was also the issue of strength in limited spaces. Automotive and aeronautical design placed a premium on saving weight and space. In many applications, engineers needed to use a bolt with a high tensile strength, but they might be threading it into a thin-walled casting. A coarse thread, with its deeper grooves, would remove more material from the internally threaded part, potentially weakening it. A thread with more, shallower threads per inch of fine thread would have a larger minor diameter, leaving more material in the core of the bolt and the walls of the nut, resulting in a stronger connection in certain contexts, particularly in terms of tensile stress area. Recognizing these new requirements, the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers, SALAM, and its successor, the Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE, took the lead. In 1906, the SAE established a new standard, initially known as the LAM standard and later as the SE standard. This was a fine-threaded series designed to complement the existing USS coarse-threaded series. It used the exact same 60-degree thread form with the flat top and bottom as the Sellers standard, a testament to the enduring excellence of that original design. The only difference was the pitch. For any given diameter, the SAE series specified a greater number of threads per inch. For example, where a quarter-inch USS bolt had 20 threads per inch, a quarter-inch SAE bolt had 28. A half-an-inch USS bolt had 13 TPI, while its SAE counterpart had 20. The SAE fine thread series offered several advantages for its intended applications. The shallower helix angle provided greater resistance to loosening under vibration. The finer pitch allowed for more precise adjustments, and the larger tensile stress area offered a strength advantage in many designs. The rise of the SAE series did not replace the USS standard. It supplemented it. Engineers now had a choice. For general assembly, heavy construction, and situations where quick assembly was desired, the coarse USS thread was ideal. For high-vibration environments, precision adjustments, and high-strength, thin-walled applications, the fine SAE thread was the superior choice. This development marked a new level of maturity in the world of standardization. The recognition that a one-size-fits-all approach was not always optimal, and that a family of compatible standards could provide a more versatile toolkit for the modern engineer. By the second decade of the 20th century, the American screw thread landscape had settled into a stable, if slightly duplicative, state. There were two widely accepted and complementary standards, both based on the original seller's thread form. The United States Standard USS for coarse threads, and the Society of Automotive Engineers SA standard for fine threads. While this was a vast improvement over the chaos of the 19th century, it was still not perfectly unified. The existence of two separate standards, maintained by different bodies, created some potential for confusion. The final step in this process of rationalization was to bring these two standards together under a single, unified national system. This effort was spearheaded by the newly created National Screw Thread Commission, which was established by an act of Congress in 1918. The creation of this federal commission, which included representatives from the Departments of War, Navy, and Commerce, as well as from the ASME and SAE, signaled the ultimate importance of screw thread standardization to the national interest. Their mandate was to establish a single, comprehensive, and authoritative set of screw thread standards for the United States, for use by both government and private industry. The Commission undertook a massive review of existing practices. They did not seek to reinvent the wheel. They recognized the overwhelming success and utility of the existing USS and SEE series. Their primary work was one of harmonization and nomenclature. They formally adopted the USS series as the primary standard for coarse threads and the SEE series as the primary standard for fine threads. To eliminate the confusing dual standard names, they introduced a new, unified designation system. The old USS series was renamed the American National Standard Coarse Thread Series, or simply NC. The old SAE series was renamed the American National Standard Fine Thread Series, or simply NF. This was a simple but profound change. A bolt was no longer specified by its historical origin, USS or SAE, but by its functional characteristic, coarse or fine. The new nomenclature was clear, logical, and unified. A half-inch bolt with 13 threads per inch was now a January 2nd, 13 NC. A half-inch bolt with 20 threads per inch was a January 2nd, 20 NF. Both were part of the same American National family, both sharing the identical seller's 60-degree thread profile. The work of the Commission went further. They also standardized the classes of fit from Class 1 loose to Class 4 tight, providing a clear system for engineers to specify tolerances. They also established standards for other, more specialized threads, such as an extra fine series, NEF, and series for specific applications like pipe threads, NPT. The result of their work, first published in 1921 and revised several times thereafter, was a comprehensive document known as Report of the National Screw Thread Commission. This document became the Bible of American screw threads for the next several decades. It represented the culmination of the journey that William Sellers had begun nearly 60 years earlier. The pandemonium of the 1850s had been replaced by a rational, coherent, and nationally endorsed family of standards. The NC and NF designations marked the final, triumphant codification of order over chaos. If the slow, creeping adoption of the U.S. standard characterized the late 19th century, the First World War served as a cataclysmic event that brutally reinforced the absolute necessity of standardization and accelerated its final victory. The war was a conflict of unprecedented industrial scale. It was a war of machines, of artillery, machine guns, trucks, airplanes, and ships. The ability to produce this material in vast quantities and to maintain it on the battlefields of Europe was a decisive factor in the outcome of the war. For the United States, which entered the war in 1917, this presented a monumental industrial challenge, and screw-thread standards were at the very heart of it. When the U.S. began its massive mobilization effort, it quickly became apparent that while standardization had made great strides, it was not yet universal. The military was placing enormous orders with thousands of different private manufacturers, from massive automobile companies to small machine shops. To build the Liberty truck, a standardized military vehicle, for example, parts were being made by dozens of different contractors all over the country. For these parts to come together on the assembly line, and more importantly, for them to be interchangeable for repairs in the field, they had to be made to a single, rigorously enforced standard. The U.S. standard, by then being harmonized into the NC/NF system, was the obvious and only choice. The war effort acted as a giant, nationwide enforcement mechanism for the standard. Government contracts explicitly and non-negotiably specified American national threads. Factories that had previously clung to their own proprietary systems were forced to convert, and quickly, if they wanted a piece of the lucrative wartime production. Government inspectors, armed with standard plug and ring gauges, were deployed to factories to ensure compliance. A batch of bolts that did not meet the standard was not just a minor problem. It was a threat to the war effort, and it would be rejected. The economic pressure to conform was immense and immediate. The experience of producing the Liberty aircraft engine is another powerful example. This was a marvel of mass production, with its 12 cylinders and thousands of components, including a vast number of high-strength threaded fasteners. The tolerances were tight, and the need for reliability was absolute. The engine was built using the fine-threaded SAE, soon to be NF, standard to resist vibration and provide maximum strength. The fact that parts from an engine built by Ford could be interchanged with one built by Lincoln or Cadillac was a direct result of the decades-long push for standardization. It would have been utterly impossible in the bespoke world of 1860. The war laid bare the military and industrial logic of standardization in the most dramatic way possible. It was no longer an abstract debate for engineering committees. It was a matter of life and death, of victory and defeat. The lessons learned in the crucible of the war were seared into the consciousness of American industry. Companies that had been forced to convert to the national standard during the war saw the benefits of efficiency and compatibility, and had no desire to return to their old, insular ways after the armistice. The First World War, in its terrible and destructive way, completed the process of standardization, burning away the last vestiges of resistance and cementing the American national thread system as the undisputed, universal standard for the nation's industrial might. While the United States was successfully consolidating its industrial base around the American national sellers thread system, a parallel story was unfolding across the rest of the industrial world. The triumph of the U.S. standard within its own borders did not solve the problem on a global scale. In fact, it solidified a major division in the mechanical world, creating a lingering ocean of incompatibility that persists to this day. The two dominant thread systems of the early 20th century, the American system and the British Whitworth system, were fundamentally and irreconcilably different. This was a clash of two industrial philosophies, embodied in metal. On one side was the American 60-degree thread angle with its flat crests and roots. On the other was the British 55-degree angle with its rounded crests and roots. A half-an-inch in C bolt from an American factory could not, under any circumstances, be threaded into a half-inch British standard Whitworth BSW nut. They had different angles, different forms, and even different pitches. The American bolt had 13 threads per inch. The British one had 12. This was not a minor difference. It was total incompatibility. This divide had profound consequences, particularly during the Second World War. The United States and Great Britain were close allies, fighting a common enemy. The U.S. supplied Britain with immense quantities of military hardware through the Lend-Lease program, including tanks, planes, and vehicles. But this alliance was constantly plagued by the screw-thread problem. An American-made Sherman tank that broke down in the field could not be easily repaired with standard British fasteners. Mechanics had to maintain two complete sets of tools, two complete inventories of spare nuts and bolts. A simple repair could be delayed for hours or days while the correct American standard part was located. It was a logistical nightmare that wasted time, resources, and manpower. The story is often told of Rolls-Royce having to retool its Merlin engine factories to use American threads for the engines destined for American-built P-51 Mustang fighters, a hugely expensive and complex undertaking in the middle of a war. The problem was not limited to the Anglo-American world. In continental Europe, a third major system was developing, the metric screw thread, based on the same 60-degree angle as the Cellar system. It was nonetheless incompatible because its diameters and pitches were based on the millimeter, not the inch. A metric M12 bolt was close in size to a half-an-inch American bolt, but they were not interchangeable. Thus, by the mid-20th century, the world was divided into three major, incompatible thread empires: the American Unified Inch System, the British Whitworth Inch System, and the European Metric System. This global divide was the final, grand-scale version of the problem that Sellers had set out to solve within a single nation. The dream of universal interchangeability remained elusive. After World War II, a major effort was made to bridge the Anglo-American divide, resulting in the unified UNC/UNF thread standard, which essentially adopted the American 60-degree profile, but made some compromises to better align with British practices. The Whitworth standard was gradually phased out in favor of this unified system, and later, the ISO metric system. But the fundamental divide between the inch-based unified world and the millimeter-based metric world remains the most significant ocean of incompatibility in modern engineering, a lasting legacy of the separate paths to standardization taken by the great industrial powers. Walk into any hardware store or machine shop in the United States today, and you will be walking through the living legacy of William Sellers. The rows of bins filled with nuts and bolts, the taps and dies hanging on the wall, the very language used by the people who work there. It is all shaped by the decisions made by that Franklin Institute committee in the 1860s. The U.S. Standard, in its modern guise as the Unified Course, UNC, and Unified Fine, UNF series, remains the dominant system for an enormous range of applications in North America. The designations themselves, a quarter 20, January 4th, 20 UNC, or a 1032, a hashtag 10-32 UNF, are the direct descendants of the table's sellers and his committee first drew up. The 60-degree thread profile is ubiquitous. The fundamental logic of a course series for general use and a fine series for vibration resistance and precision adjustment continues to govern engineering choices every day. When a mechanic services an American-made car, when a construction worker erects a steel frame, when a homeowner assembles a piece of equipment, they are almost certainly interacting with the ghost of the seller standard. It is a system so deeply embedded in the American material culture that it has become invisible, the default assumption. However, the legacy is not one of unqualified, monolithic triumph. It is also a legacy of division. The persistence of the inch-based unified system in the United States, in the face of the near-global adoption of the ISO metric system, is a direct consequence of the 19th century decision to create a separate American standard rather than adopting the British one. The U.S. is one of the last remaining industrial nations where the inch system remains in widespread common use. This creates a constant, low-level friction in a globalized economy. American companies that export products must often produce two versions, one with unified fasteners for the domestic market and one with metric fasteners for the rest of the world. Mechanics working on imported cars need a complete second set of metric wrenches, taps, and dies. This is the ocean of incompatibility brought home to the local garage. This duality makes the modern American workshop a unique museum of thread history. A mechanic will often have a drawer of UNC/UNF fasteners right next to a drawer of ISO metric fasteners. They become adept at recognizing the subtle differences by eye, knowing that an AM8 bolt is close to, but dangerously different from, a 5/16 inch bolt. This daily negotiation between two incompatible systems is a constant, practical reminder of the historical path of standardization. It shows that while standards can create perfect order within a closed system, the interaction between different, well-established standards creates a new and more complex kind of chaos. The ghost of William Sellers' system is not just a ghost of order. It is also the ghost of a choice, a decision to forge a uniquely American path, the consequences of which are still being measured, in both inches and millimeters, in every workshop in the land. We have now spent a considerable amount of time tracing the slow, technical, and decidedly undramatic history of a single, standardized object. It is easy, at the end of such a journey, to see it as a mere story of industrial efficiency, a footnote in the history of manufacturing. But to do so would be to miss the more profound implications of what we have discussed. The standardization of the screw thread is more than a technical story. It is a philosophical one. It is about the very nature of order, the power of consensus, and the unseen architecture that underpins modern civilization. At its core, the story of the screw thread is a parable of language. Before the standard, the world of fasteners was a world without a common grammar. Each workshop spoke its own mechanical dialect. A bolt and nut were a private conversation between the craftsmen who made them. The Seller Standard was, in essence, the creation of a universal language. The 60-degree angle, the flat top and bottom, the tables of pitches and diameters. These were the grammar and syntax of a new, unambiguous mode of communication. An engineering drawing became a perfectly clear and translatable sentence. A 1/2 13-inch bolt is a statement of such clarity that it can be understood and perfectly replicated by a machinist in a different city, a different decade, who has never met the original designer. This shared language is what makes the complex, distributed manufacturing of our global economy possible. Without it, we would be back in the pre-standardization pandemonium, a world of mechanical miscommunication. Furthermore, the story is a testament to the power of rational, voluntary consensus. The U.S. standard was not, for the most part, imposed by government decree. It triumphed because it was a superior idea, persuasively argued and willingly adopted by a community of practitioners who recognized its value. It was a victory of the common good over individual preference. It required countless individuals and powerful corporations to subordinate their own established practices, their house standards, to a shared system for the benefit of all. This process of setting aside individual habits for a collective, rationalized order is a microcosm of the social contract itself. It is the very foundation of a functioning, complex society. We agree on traffic laws, on currency, on weights and measures, and on the pitch of a screw thread, because the alternative is a paralyzing chaos. Finally, the standardized screw thread serves as a powerful metaphor for the invisible structures that hold our world together. We navigate our daily lives surrounded by a vast, intricate web of standards, protocols, and agreements that we never see or consider. The electricity from the wall socket, the data flowing through the internet, the shipping container that brings goods across the ocean. All of these rely on a bedrock of painstakingly negotiated standards. The screw thread is perhaps the most primal and physical example of this phenomenon. It is the literal fastener of our built environment, a humble, uncelebrated linchpin of modernity. Its uniformity is a quiet promise that the world is, in some small but fundamental way, rational, predictable, and reparable. It is a testament to our ability to find a common thread, to agree on a single, right way of doing something, and in doing so, to build a world far more complex and resilient than would ever be possible in its absence. We have thus arrived at the end of our protracted inquiry. We have journeyed from the chaotic workshop of the 1850s, a place of bespoke creation and frustrating incompatibility, to the ordered and systematic world of the modern, standardized fastener. We have followed the measured deliberations of the Franklin Institute, appreciated the cold, rational logic of William Sellers, and witnessed the slow, inexorable march of a superior idea as it conquered the industrial landscape of a nation. We have seen how a seemingly minor technical detail, the shape of a helical groove on a piece of iron, became a matter of national industrial strategy, military necessity, and ultimately, a foundational element of mass production. The story of the screw thread is the story of an invisible revolution. It lacks the celebrated heroes and dramatic turning points of political history, yet its impact on our material lives is arguably just as profound. The quiet consensus reached in those committee rooms did more to enable the modern world of interchangeable parts, of reliable machinery, and of global supply chains than any single, more famous invention. It is the silent, unsung hero of our industrial age. The next time you assemble a piece of furniture, repair an engine, or simply look at a piece of machinery, take a moment to consider the humble bolt that holds it together. See in its precise, uniform threads not just a fastener, but a symbol. It is a symbol of order wrested from chaos, of communication across time and distance, and of the collective, rational effort to build a more functional world. It is a monument to the idea that sometimes the most important revolutions are the ones that happen quietly, in the meticulous pursuit of a common standard. Thank you for your sustained attention to this matter. If this detailed examination has provided you with a measure of intellectual satisfaction, I once again extend the invitation to subscribe to this channel. Your comments, as always, are welcome below. We are particularly interested to hear if this chronicle has altered your perception of the mundane objects that constitute our world.